Hey Mustangs, in this video we're going to be taking a look at some background information for the first stage of photosynthesis, which is the light-dependent reactions. So let's go ahead and take a look first at the reason why this happens. So in order to really understand stuff in science, you need to know why it's even happening. I mean, there's a lot of complex steps and reactions that happen, but if you know why from the beginning, you can figure out the steps in between. So why do these light-dependent reactions happen? The whole purpose of the light-dependent reactions is to convert solar energy into chemical energy. And in this case, when we talk about chemical energy, we're not talking about glucose just yet. We do want to get energy stored in glucose, but here during the light-dependent reactions, we are going to convert solar energy into chemical energy in the form of ATP and NADPH. So if you take a look here, we take solar energy. This is ATP. This should look familiar to you. So adenosine triphosphate, there's our 1, 2, 3 phosphates there. And then NADPH, when we learned about cellular respiration, we learned about NADP, or NADH, sorry, NAD plus and NADH. This is a little bit different. What's interesting about those two is that they're almost identical to each other. The thing that makes this different from NADH is right here, this phosphate group. On NADH, it's another OH group. So there's an OH group there. On NADH, it's another OH group. Whereas here with NADP, that's where the P comes from in this one. So the P is that additional phosphate that you don't see in NADH. Now, in order to distinguish between the two, not just when you're looking at the molecules, but when you look at the words themselves, the P, think of P for photosynthesis. So that way you don't get confused. If the P is missing, then it's for cellular respiration. If it has the P in it, P for photosynthesis, that's what this one's going to be involved in. So whole point of our first step, light-dependent reactions, is to convert solar energy into chemical energy in the form of NADPH and ATP. Now, to really understand what's going on, we need to get some background information on light and how it works and how energy will be trapped from light. So sunlight is known as electromagnetic energy or electromagnetic radiation. And when we look at sunlight, we actually don't see everything, all the parts of light. The human eye can only pick up a small portion of the spectrum, and we call that visible light. So if you look here, this is all of the parts of light, of the electromagnetic energy or radiation. And you can see we have gamma rays, X-rays, UV, and then we have our visible spectrum. This is what we can see with the human eye. We can't see these with the human eye. And then past the visible spectrum on the other side, we have infrared, microwaves, and radio waves. Now, in order to understand what's going on with photosynthesis, we need to know about the different wavelengths that we see in all of these. So wavelengths are the distance from one wave to the next. So if I were to draw a wave here, okay, a wavelength you could measure from here to here, or you could measure from there to there. Okay, so you can measure the wavelength. On this end of the spectrum, they have very, very super small waves, so nanometers, very, very small. Whereas here, radio waves, they can be kilometers long, so very long waves. So you have short waves that go really close together to long waves that are very drawn out. Okay, so these waves are going to be important in determining energy that can be absorbed from sunlight. So the most important for sunlight involve the visible light here. So waves that are from 380 nanometers to 750 nanometers. Those are going to be the important ones for photosynthesis. When we look at the visible spectrum here, we see from violet to red the different wavelengths. So violet has shorter wavelengths than red does. So red has longer wavelengths, and you could see, if you think of Roy G. Biv, as you go through the visible light spectrum, the waves get shorter from red all the way to violet. Now, this will be important again for how the light will be absorbed and what type of light will be absorbed during photosynthesis. Another important thing involved with understanding light and what's going on with it. So not only does light move in waves, we can identify that it has some properties of a particle. There's a lot of debate about this. Is it a particle? Is it a wave? So there's a lot still we're trying to figure out with this. But we call the particles of light, we call them photons. So a photon is a particle of light. And when you're talking about violet light, it has short wavelengths. So violet light actually has more energy. We'd say photons from violet light have more energy because it has short wavelengths than photons from red light. Photons from red light have less energy. So if we take a look here at this picture, you could picture kind of photons moving along like a wave here. As photons move along, red moves along like that. You have your violet that moves along, and you can see it even seems more energetic when you watch it moving around. You see the red kind of lazy as it moves along here, or as you see the violet, it moves very, very rapidly. So it has more energy. The shorter wavelengths have more energy than the longer wavelengths. Pigments are very, very important, and you could probably think of a super, super important pigment when you think of photosynthesis, and the one that pops in your head is probably chlorophyll. So pigments, when you talk about light hitting an object, when light hits an object, it can either be reflected, transmitted, or absorbed. And where pigments come in here is pigments are molecules that actually absorb certain wavelengths of light. So they can absorb certain amounts of energy from light. The main pigments of photosynthesis are going to be chlorophyll A. That is a huge, huge one of the most important ones. And then there's what we call accessory pigments, which are chlorophyll B and carotenoids. When we look at chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, if you look here, this is the structure that we see of chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. The difference between chlorophyll A and B comes right here in this group. Depending on what's here, it could be chlorophyll A, or if we replace it with this, you have chlorophyll B. This top portion here, this is the portion that's involved in absorbing the energy from light. So this is a very important part here. Carotenoids are actually hydrocarbons. They have long hydrocarbon chains here, and they're involved also in absorbing energy. And it's hypothesized that carotenoids are there to absorb different wavelengths of light. So to allow the plant to absorb not just what you can get from chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, but other wavelengths that they don't quite absorb. And another hypothesis is that they're there in order to help kind of absorb excess light that would damage chlorophyll, especially chlorophyll A, because that's one of the most important ones. So it acts as like a protectant or a sunscreen. You can think of it as a sunscreen too. And that's a hypothesis for that. Now, these are what make the plant look green because they reflect green light. These guys, carotenoids, usually cause plants to look either green, not green, yellow or orange. So what happens when chlorophyll absorbs light? The way chlorophyll absorbs light has to do with electrons. So here's electrons again. Electrons were very important in moving around energy in cellular respiration. Same thing we're going to see here. Electrons are very important here. So when a photon hits a chlorophyll molecule, it's actually going to excite its electrons and cause them to move from what we call the ground state to an excited state. The excited state is when it's absorbed the energy from the photon. So we have a visual here. So here is going to represent a photon. Here's my chlorophyll molecule, and the yellow is going to represent an electron. Now this is so not to scale in any way, shape, or form. So we're just taking a look so that way we have a visual of what's going on. So I said on the last slide that when a photon hits a chlorophyll molecule, it causes its electrons, or one of its electrons, to go from a ground state, where it's nice and stable, to an excited state, where energy's been absorbed. So let's go ahead and see what happens here. So photon comes along, it hits the chlorophyll molecule, and that's going to cause the electron to go to a higher or excited state. And you see these rings here, these represent the electron shells. So it goes from one electron shell to another, and that's a higher energy state. Now, once it gets to this point, if we had a chlorophyll molecule that's kind of by itself in isolation, when it gets to this point here, what's going to happen is within a billionth of a second, it's actually going to drop back down to its original electron shell. And when it drops back down, that actually causes it to release its energy as it goes back to its ground state. So this was the ground state, this was the excited state. As it goes back down, it releases energy in the form of heat. Sometimes it could actually, as it drops back down, it could release energy in the form of photons. So it actually release energy that way. And in that case, we call that fluorescence.